By the middle of 1944, the skies over Europe had become both a battlefield and a graveyard. For years, Allied bombers had crossed the Channel day after day, droning toward Germany through smoke and flak and fire, while the Luftwaffe clawed desperately at the edge of its own defeat. But in those last months before the invasion of Normandy, something changed. Something strange began to appear among the clouds. Massive bombers, B-17s, B-24s, Dakotas, and sleek P-47s, and Spitfires that once shimmered in plain olive drab or dull silver now wore thick, unmistakable stripes, black and white, painted hastily across their wings and fuselages. From the ground, they looked like flying beasts wearing zebra hide. To the German soldiers who saw them first through the haze of dawn, the sight seemed unnatural, even ominous. For the men in the air, the stripes were not decoration or bravado, they were lifeline. They were called invasion stripes, and their creation was born from fear, the kind of fear that came not from the enemy, but from the terrible possibility of being mistaken. As Allied forces prepared for Operation Overlord, the greatest amphibious invasion in history, chaos loomed as their greatest enemy. The sheer scale of coordination between air, land, and sea forces was unprecedented. Thousands of planes, tens of thousands of ships, and hundreds of thousands of men, all converging on one thin line of French coast. And every side, every branch, every unit had its own aircraft, its own symbols, its own way of marking what was friendly. The risk was terrifyingly simple, that Allied troops might open fire on their own. The men on the beaches, the gunners aboard destroyers, even the fighter pilots themselves might not recognize who was who in the storm of D-Day. In the weeks leading up to the invasion, the Allied High Command demanded a solution that would be unmistakable, a universal code that could be read at a glance, in the chaos of combat, from the ground, the sea, or the sky. The answer came from a single order issued in secrecy on June 3, 1944. It instructed every aircraft taking part in the invasion to be marked immediately with 5 alternating black and white stripes, each exactly 18 inches wide on single-engine planes and 24 on twin-engine aircraft. They would wrap around the wings and the fuselage, front and back, like the bars of a cage. The purpose was not artistic. It was psychological clarity in the fog of war. The markings would scream, "We are friendly. Do not shoot." When the order reached the airfields of southern England, chaos broke loose. Not the chaos of fear, but of urgency. There was no time for proper tools, no stencils, no carefully measured lines. Ground crews raided supply sheds for paint, brushes, mops, even brooms. Some used old rags dipped in bucket under floodlights. Men knelt in the mud, slapping on paint as bombers sat lined up in rows like sleeping giants. The air reeked of oil and gasoline, and the rhythmic sound of brushes rasping against aluminum filled the night. In some places, the paint ran down the sides in streaks. On others, the stripes were crooked or uneven. It didn't matter. What mattered was speed. Somewhere above them, the German radar operators were watching. The window for secrecy was closing. By dawn on June 6th, the work was done. The sun rose red over the Channel, and as it did, the sky began to rumble. One by one, the zebra-striped planes took off, engines howling, wings glinting in the morning light. From the ground, they looked like a swarm, an endless tide of black and white wings blotting out the horizon. Each aircraft carried men who had trained, hoped, and feared for this moment for years. When they crossed into occupied France, German observers radioed frantic reports to command. The Luftwaffe pilots who scrambled to intercept were stunned. They'd never seen markings like these before, and at first they thought they were facing a new Allied model, something experimental, something terrifying. One pilot later described it as watching a sky full of ghosts wearing uniform. The stripes did their job. Allied gunners on ships and in landing zones recognized the pattern instantly. Friendly fire incidents dropped dramatically compared to earlier counts. The black and white pattern saved lives. But something unexpected happened too, something no one had planned for. The Luftwaffe, already weakened and outnumbered, found itself facing not just an air force, but a vision of inevitability. To many German pilots, the stripes became a symbol of Allied dominance, of an enemy too organized, too vast, too powerful to stop. Some Luftwaffe fighters turned away rather than attack, claiming that the stripes made range estimation nearly impossible. Others admitted something more human. They hesitated because the sight of those painted wings meant one thing: the war was turning, and they were losing. What began as a crude field order became a legend. The invasion stripes weren't just paint, they were psychological armor. They turned machines into statements, a visual declaration that the Allies were no longer hiding, no longer sneaking into occupied Europe one mission at a time. They were coming in daylight, in formation, in numbers that darkened the sky. And for the men who looked up from the beaches of Normandy that morning, the black and white wings above weren't just a signal of recognition. They were a promise that they weren't alone, that the skies belonged to them now, and that freedom was returning to Europe on the back of those striped machines. Comment below where you're watching this from. It's incredible how far the echoes of those painted wings still reach. The stripes were more than identification marks. They were symbols of something deeper, something the world had never truly seen before. By 1944, the Allied war effort was a machine unlike any in history. America, Britain, Canada, Australia, and dozens of other nations had gathered their resources into a single colossal force. But unity was fragile. Every country had its own command, its own equipment, its own pride. The invasion of Normandy was not just a military operation, it was a test of whether the Allies could truly act as one. In that sense, those black and white bands were not just for safety. They were a visual language of cooperation, painted onto metal wings that carried the hopes of millions. They erased national colors, blended identity, and told everyone, on the ground, at sea, in the air, that for this moment, they fought under one symbol. At airfields from Cornwall to Kent, the mood was electric in those final days before D-Day. Pilots smoked silently beside their planes as crews rushed with brushes and buckets. Many didn't even know why they were painting. The order had been classified, and rumors spread fast. Some believed it was camouflage for night missions. Others thought it was an experiment with radar interference. Only a few realized the truth. They were preparing for something bigger than any mission before, something that would decide the fate of Europe. One mechanic at RAF Tangmere later recalled, "We didn't know the name of the beaches or the plan, but we knew this. The world was about to change, and our paint was part of it." The visual impact of those stripes cannot be overstated. When thousands of aircraft took off on June 6th, they filled the sky like a storm. The black and white bands flashed and twisted in the sunlight, glinting off aluminum, reflecting in the waves below. Soldiers on the beaches later said it looked like the sky itself was striped, like the heavens were marching in rhythm with the invasion. To the men fighting on the ground, those markings became a source of comfort. Amid the gunfire and chaos, when they saw those patterns sweeping overhead, they knew help had arrived. It wasn't just visual recognition, it was emotional reassurance. Yet, not everything about the stripes was triumph. The decision to paint them was also a confession, an acknowledgement of human error and the chaos of war. The Allies had learned that technology alone couldn't prevent tragedy. During earlier campaigns in Sicily and Italy, dozens of Allied planes had been shot down by friendly fire. Misidentification had claimed hundreds of lives. Commanders knew that on D-Day, with thousands of men storming the beaches and naval guns firing blind through the smoke, the risk would be catastrophic, so they turned to the simplest solution imaginable: color and contrast. Black and white, a child's logic applied to the machinery of war. And it worked, because in the confusion of combat, simplicity saves lives. The Luftwaffe, however, saw something different. For years, they had ruled the skies, feared and respected for their precision. But by 1944, they were stretched thin, low on fuel, short on pilots. Their training rushed, their airfields bombed daily. When they first saw those striped formations pouring over the channel, their instinct wasn't attack, it was disbelief. Reports from surviving Luftwaffe aces describe confusion at the scale of the invasion. "The sky was full," one German pilot later said. "Everywhere we looked, black and white wings. We thought perhaps it was a trick, or that the war was already lost." In that moment, those stripes became psychological warfare, a banner of dominance. They told the enemy, without words, that resistance was futile. But the irony was that many of those aircraft were manned by boys barely out of their teens. The pilots flying striped Mustangs and Thunderbolts carried fear in their chests, just like their enemies. They had memorized their targets, their formations, their radio code, but they also carried pictures of home tucked behind cockpit dials. They weren't thinking about symbolism or strategy. They were thinking about survival. Still, when they looked out across the formation and saw hundreds of planes wearing the same black and white bands, they felt something stir, a kind of belonging that no uniform could give. In that moment, every man, every machine, was part of one living organism. After D-Day, the invasion stripes became famous overnight. War correspondents wrote about them. Soldiers painted them on helmets. Even artists back home sketched them as emblems of victory. But within months, the very thing that had symbolized unity became a risk. The Luftwaffe, adapting quickly, began to use captured Allied planes painted with imitation stripes to infiltrate formations. By late 1944, orders went out to remove or tone down the marking, especially on upper wings. What had begun as a life-saving idea faded quietly into history, its purpose fulfilled, its legacy sealed in photographs and memories. Still, decades later, veterans would talk about those stripes with reverence. They would say that the paint wasn't just for identification, it was a promise. It meant that despite fear, confusion, and loss, humanity could still come together to fight for something greater. The black stripes stood for the darkness of war, the white for the hope that pierced through it. And in that fragile contrast, rough brushstrokes over cold metal, lay the story of every man who took to the skies that day. War leaves behind countless symbols, but few as powerful as those stripes. They weren't medals or flags or slogans. They were temporary marks, fading with rain and wind. Yet they carried the weight of a generation's courage. When the last veteran spoke of them, his eyes didn't see paint. They saw friends who never came home, engines roaring over beaches of blood and sand, and the strange beauty of survival painted in black and white. If this story made you reflect on the human side of war, the fear, the unity, the fragile hope, make sure to subscribe. There's still so much history hidden beneath the surface, and together we'll uncover every story behind the steel and smoke. Dawn broke hard over northern France. Smoke and mist mixed above the hedgerow, and the sound of engines filled the air like thunder rolling over the sea. It was June 7th, 1944, the day after the invasion, and the sky belonged to the Allies. Squadrons of striped bombers crossed the channel in endless waves, their engines synchronized, their wings casting shadows over ships and fields below. From the beaches to the farmlands beyond Caen, anyone who looked up saw the same thing, black and white, a rhythm of power and inevitability. At 10,000 feet, the air was cold, and the smell of oil and cordite clung to everything. The bomber crews were tense, not because of the enemy, but because they hadn't seen him yet. For years, every run into occupied Europe meant one thing: interception. The Luftwaffe would come screaming out of the sun, yellow-nosed Messerschmitts and grey Focke-Wulfs diving through the formation, guns flashing, engines howling. The men in the bombers would curse, sweat, and pray as tracers whipped past the windows, and flak burst like black flowers around them. But on that morning, the sky was empty, no contrails above, no dark shapes cutting through the clouds. Just the steady hum of thousands of Allied engines, flying unchallenged. Radar stations along the French coast had already warned the Germans. The Allied invasion had come, and their skies were collapsing. In a few remaining Luftwaffe bases scattered across northern France, young pilots sat in cockpits waiting for the order to scramble. Some had only 20 hours of flight training. Others were veterans who had fought since the Battle of Britain. But as they taxied onto runways pitted with bomb craters, many hesitated. Out there, beyond the haze, were hundreds, maybe thousands, of striped planes. The stripes meant invasion. The stripes meant the end. When the first Luftwaffe formations climbed into the air, they could see them immediately, wave after wave of aircraft, stretching from horizon to horizon, all marked with those strange, bold bands. From a distance, the patterns distorted under the sunlight. The black and white shimmered, flickering as the wings turned. To the German pilots, it was disorienting, a hypnotic movement that made it impossible to judge speed or distance. Their rangefinders lied. Their instincts failed. Every time they tried to line up a shot, the pattern broke their focus. Some called it fliegende Schatten, the flying shadow. Others called it madness. But there was another reason for their hesitation, deeper than confusion. Many Luftwaffe squadrons were running on fumes. Their fuel depots had been bombed to rubble by the same aircraft now flying overhead. Each mission risked total annihilation, and every pilot knew it. The orders from Berlin were clear: attack at all costs. But from their cockpits, the young Germans saw something no photograph or intelligence briefing could prepare them for. The invasion stripes were not scattered or improvised. They were everywhere, on every wing, every fuselage, perfectly aligned across hundreds of planes flying in formation. It was a message written in the sky: you are outnumbered, outgunned, and out of time. Several Luftwaffe aces would later recall those moments with bitterness. One, Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Lange, described his first encounter in a post-war interview. They looked like a wall of black and white. You couldn't see where one ended and the next began. It wasn't like fighting aircraft. It was like watching a storm. My commander gave the order to climb, but I didn't. I told myself the war was already lost. Those stripes were the proof. While some turned away, others tried. A few Me-109s dove on a formation of Dakotas carrying paratroopers. They fired short bursts, scored a few hits, but the return fire from escorting Mustangs was immediate and merciless. Within minutes, the attackers were gone. One Dakota limped back to England with holes torn through its wings. The rest pressed on, their cargo of men silent and pale. Below them, the beaches were a blur of movement and sound, artillery, smoke, chaos. And above it all, those striped wings passed again and again, an unending chorus of engines. For Allied crews, the absence of Luftwaffe fighters was both relief and unease. They knew it couldn't last. Every mission, they expected to see the enemy come roaring back, but the Germans never came in force again. Instead, they sent scattered groups, flying low, striking quickly, then vanishing. The skies had changed. The Luftwaffe was no longer the hunter, it was the hunted. The invasion stripes became symbols of dominance, of a turning tide that even the enemy could not deny. In German propaganda broadcasts, officials dismissed the markings as childish camouflage, a desperate attempt to disguise failing aircraft. But soldiers on the front lines knew better. They watched the sky darken with striped wings and felt dread. Civilians too whispered that the stripes meant the Allies were coming, not as raiders this time, but as conquerors. Children in occupied towns pointed upward and said, "The zebras are here!" The most haunting accounts come from captured Luftwaffe. Interrogation reports describe the same phrase repeated over and over. There were too many. The psychological blow was complete. By stripping away individuality, by giving every aircraft the same bold marking, the Allies had created a visual illusion of invincibility. It wasn't one squadron or one country. It was an army of the air, unified by paint. The Germans had spent years perfecting camouflage, stealth, and surprise. Now, they faced an enemy that didn't hide at all. The black and white stripes screamed visibility, and that visibility terrified. As the campaign in Normandy dragged on, the Luftwaffe's resistance dwindled further. By late June, Allied aircraft could operate almost at will. They strafed convoys, destroyed rail lines, bombed troop columns, and hunted anything that moved. The once feared German fighter wings were grounded by lack of fuel and morale. The invasion stripes, born from a fear of friendly fire, had evolved into something symbolic, a banner of supremacy that spread across Europe. It's strange to think that paint could end battles before they began, but war is as much psychological as it is physical. When the Luftwaffe refused to engage, they didn't surrender to the stripes themselves. They surrendered to what they represented: power, unity, inevitability. The black and white bands became the visual sound of Allied engines, the rhythm of invasion. They were the last thing many on the ground saw before realizing the war had turned against them for good. For historians, the day the Luftwaffe looked up and chose not to fight marks more than just a tactical shift. It marks the moment when Germany lost control of the air, and with it, the war's momentum. For those who lived it, the memory is simpler. They remember the silence. No sirens, no fighters, no screaming dives, just the constant, rolling thunder of striped planes moving east, and the quiet understanding that the tide had finally, irrevocably, turned. After Normandy, the sky belonged completely to the Allies. By July 1944, the Luftwaffe was a ghost of its former self. Allied pilots crossed the French countryside with impunity, flying low enough to see the expressions of soldiers running for cover. The invasion stripes still gleamed on their wings, faded now by sun and rain, but still unmistakable. Black and white, order and chaos, the symbol of a new phase of war, one where the line between necessity and cruelty blurred in the open air. In the first weeks after D-Day, bomber crews watched the land beneath them transform. What had been fields and villages became smoking craters. Roads vanished under broken convoy. Trains lay twisted beside shattered tracks. Rivers glowed orange at night with burning fuel. Allied air power was not just winning battles, it was erasing the map. Every column of German armor moving toward Normandy was struck. Every bridge, every depot, every attempt to regroup met the same fate: a roar from above and the fall of striped shadows. It was absolute, merciless efficiency. From a distance, it looked like order, precision bombs falling on coordinates. But for those on the ground, it was chaos. French civilians, trapped in occupied towns, learned to read the stripes with mixed feelings. The sight of them meant liberation was near, but it also meant destruction would arrive first. Survivors later recalled how the sound of Allied planes made children cheer and old men weep. A woman from St. Lo remembered watching a formation of typhoons sweep low across the fields and said, "We prayed for, and we prayed for ourselves, because the sky didn't miss." Pilots, too, began to feel the weight of victory. Their missions were longer now, their targets more vulnerable. They flew not against fighters but against retreating columns, broken armies, desperate men with no air cover. Many confessed, years later, that it didn't feel like combat anymore. It felt like punishment. They called it the slaughter below. Stripes once painted to prevent friendly fire, now streaked through skies filled only with helpless enemies. The visual code of unity had become a symbol of dominance so total that even the victors grew uneasy under it. In briefing rooms across England, new pilots studied photos of targets, rail yards, bridges, small towns, and were told the same thing: hit everything that moves. There was no joy in it, only routine. The invasion stripes, cracked and fading, were still required on some aircraft, a reminder of D-Day's chaos. But to the veterans, those lines of paint carried ghosts. Each stroke of black and white reminded them of friends lost in earlier battle, of missions that hadn't returned. The stripes were meant to save lives, yet they had outlived their purpose and become part of a new kind of warfare, one that no longer required courage to engage the enemy, only endurance to keep flying through the wreckage. German reports from the ground tell the other side of that silence. Columns halted at the sound of engines, soldiers abandoning trucks and diving into ditches before a single shot was fired. Farmers saw Allied fighters circle overhead and knew to freeze. The Luftwaffe tried to fight back with what little remained, occasional FW-190s, desperate night sorties, but the pattern of the war had shifted forever. The few German pilots who managed to get airborne often found themselves facing not dozens but hundreds of enemies. One pilot, shot down over the Loire, told interrogators that his squadron leader had ordered them to avoid direct confrontation unless absolutely necessary. "We cannot fight the sky," he said. The moral equation of air superiority is simple, only on paper. On the ground, among the ruins, it becomes complicated. Photographs from Normandy show Allied crews posing proudly beside their striped planes, smiling at the camera. In the background, smoke rises from the villages they've bombed. None of them look cruel, just young, tired, and unsure of what victory is supposed to feel like. They had trained to fight enemies who could fight back. Now, they fought silence and destruction, watching their own power consume the landscape they came to free. Back home, newspapers printed pictures of those same striped bombers with triumphant headlines. To the public, they were proof that the tide had turned. To the men inside, the paint began to take on a different meaning. It was no longer just recognition. It was reminder. Every black stripe was a memory of darkness, every white line a fragile trace of light. Together, they symbolized the contradiction of modern war, the precision of machinery against the chaos of humanity. As Allied forces advanced deeper into France, orders came down to start removing the invasion stripes from upper surfaces. Officially, it was to reduce visibility from enemy ground fire. Unofficially, it was because their purpose had ended. The danger of friendly fire was gone. The enemy no longer challenged the skies. Ground crews scrubbed the paint off with solvent, the black running like ink down the fuselage. Some pilots resisted. One wrote in his log, "I kept mine. They remind me who we were when we needed each other most." Others let the rain wash them away naturally, until only faint traces remained, ghosts of a time when unity had been painted in haste on the eve of the world's greatest gamble. By autumn, the Luftwaffe's defeat was absolute. Allied bombers flew over Germany itself without fear. Cities burned by night, and by day, striped fighters escorted them home through clear skies. The enemy that had once ruled the air now hid underground, waiting for fuel that would never come. Yet, even as victory loomed, unease spread among the men who had earned it. The more total their dominance became, the less human it felt. They had learned that the sky could make them gods, and that gods, in war, are lonely. Decades later, historians would argue about the stripes. Some called them genius, others propaganda. But for the people who saw them, on the ground, in the air, or through the eyes of memory, they were something else entirely. They were the dividing line between chaos and control, between fear and arrogance, between survival and guilt. They were a reminder that even the most righteous war leaves scars in black and white. And so the question remains, not about paint or strategy, or even victory, but about us. When does power stop being protection and start becoming destruction? When does necessity turn into something darker? Comment below with your thoughts. And tell me, do you think dominance in war ever comes without a cost? Copy and share this. Even victory leaves shadows. When the guns finally went silent in Europe, the sky seemed emptier than anyone remembered. For the first time in years, the horizon was clear. No contrails, no smoke, no constant vibration of engines. Airfields that had once roared with life became graveyards of steel. Striped planes sat in rows, engines cold, wings streaked with mud and fading paint. Rainwater collected in the grooves of those invasion bands, turning the white to grey, the black to brown. Ground crews, who had once painted them by hand in feverish haste, now scraped them off with quiet resignation. The war that had begun with the sound of roaring aircraft ended in silence, but the stripes refused to disappear from memory. For the men who had flown under them, the stripes became shorthand for everything they'd endured. The fear, the loss, the unity, and the strange sense of purpose that bound them. Veterans would later say that they could still smell the paint whenever they closed their eyes, a mix of oil, sweat, and nervous laughter. Some described it as the scent of brotherhood. Others said it smelled like the beginning of the end. When they returned home, few talked about it openly. They carried the memory quietly, like an old scar. But in museums and hangars decades later, when one of those striped aircraft was restored to flight, they came. Men in their 80s, walking slowly, standing in the shadow of the wings they had once trusted with their lives. Some reached out and touched the paint with trembling fingers, as if to make sure it was still real. Historians often speak of the invasion stripes as a symbol of Allied cooperation, a visual statement of order and coordination. But for those who had seen them in the air, they were more emotional than strategic. They represented not just unity but fragility, the understanding that even the most powerful force in history had been built by human hands, uncertain and afraid. Each uneven brushstroke told a story of the night before D-Day, when men painted by lantern light, not knowing if they would ever see the dawn. The paint dried unevenly, flaking under the wind, but it held through storm and battle alike, much like the men themselves. The world changed quickly after the war. Jet engines replaced propellers. New conflicts demanded new technology. Camouflage became precise, mathematical, efficient. But nothing since has carried the same symbolism as those crude, hand-painted lines. When the Korean War began, some aircraft briefly wore similar patterns for recognition, but it was never quite the same. The black and white stripes belonged to a single moment in history, a moment when the world held its breath and then exhaled through fire and courage. As the decades passed, the meaning of the stripes evolved. To some, they became nostalgia, an emblem of a simpler time when good and evil seemed clearly defined. To others, they stood as reminders of what unity can achieve when the cost is accepted. In airshows today, when a restored Spitfire or C-47 Dakota roars overhead wearing those same bold stripes, crowds still look up with the same mixture of awe and melancholy. Children point and smile, but the veterans in the audience rarely smile back. They watch quietly, their eyes following the path of the aircraft until it disappears into the sun, just as it did so many years ago. For the countries that fought under that symbol, the stripes also became part of their collective identity. Britain saw them as proof that defiance could be organized into victory. America saw them as the birthmark of global leadership. Canada, Australia, and the smaller allied nations saw them as their fingerprints on history's turning point. But across Europe, in the towns and villages that had watched those striped planes pass overhead, the memory was more complicated. Liberation came from the sky, but so did destruction. Even in gratitude, there was sorrow. The black and white carried both, the joy of freedom and the grief of loss, painted together in permanent contrast. The pilots who lived long enough to tell their stories spoke of the stripes not as decoration, but as confession. They said that each mission reminded them of the cost of coordination, the price of clarity. One recalled sitting on the wing of his P-51 after the war, running his hand along the faded paint, and thinking of the friends he had lost. "We thought we painted those stripes to save each other from friendly fire. Maybe we painted them to remember who we were before the killing became routine." His words lingered in silence, heavy and unresolved, much like the memory itself. Time turned the invasion stripes from a tactical necessity into an artifact of humanity. Every photo of them carries more than military history. It carries emotion. They are the last honest marks of imperfection in a war that had tried to make everything mechanical. You can still see brushstrokes on the surviving planes, uneven edges, streaks of rain frozen under clear coat. They remind us that victory was never clean, never simple. It was painted in haste, by tired men who wanted to live. In archives and documentaries, the stripes remain a favorite image, simple, bold, instantly recognizable. But behind their clean geometry lies a truth that resists simplicity. The men who wore them did not see themselves as heroes. They were part of something vast and uncontrollable, something that changed them forever. The stripes made their aircraft visible from miles away, but inside the cockpits, those men felt invisible, small figures carried by the noise of history. Even now, more than 80 years later, when historians and filmmakers revisit that moment, they find themselves drawn to the same contrast. Black and white, fear and hope, loss and survival. The stripes endure because they mirror the human condition itself. They remind us that war, no matter how justified, leaves nothing untouched. Not the ground, not the sky, not even the paint that once promised safety. And maybe that's why they still matter. Because beneath all the strategy, technology, and noise, the war's greatest symbol was never a weapon. It was 5 rough bands of paint, brushed by hand, on the eve of a storm. When the war ended, the soldiers and airmen who had filled the European sky with striped wings returned home to a world that had no language for what they carried. The cheering crowds, the parades, the medals, all of it felt strangely hollow. They had been part of something immense, something that had changed the shape of the planet, yet they stepped off trains into quiet towns where no one truly understood what it meant to have lived inside the noise. The invasion stripes had been scrubbed from their planes, but they remained etched behind their eyes, ghosts that reappeared in dreams and sudden silences. Many veterans said the hardest sound to live without was the engine. For years, the rumble had been constant, comforting even, a heartbeat of belonging. Now, the silence was deafening. In that silence, memories rushed in. The first flight over Normandy, the smell of wet paint on the morning of June 6th, the way the sky turned silver when the sun hit the channel, and always the image of those black and white lines racing past the wings, cutting through the clouds like scars that would never fade. In letters written years later, pilots confessed feelings that they had never voiced during the war. One man wrote, "We painted the stripes to recognize each other, but when I close my eyes now, all I see are the ones we lost." Another said, "They told us the stripes meant we were safe, but they only marked how visible we were to everything that could kill us." The war had ended, but the paint remained in their minds as both pride and warning, proof that survival comes at a cost measured not in medals, but in sleepless nights. Psychologists studying veterans in the 1950s noticed something unusual among aircrew, a tendency to remember color vividly. Men who could barely recall names or dates described the shades of the sky, the glare on the fuselage, the exact contrast of black against white. The invasion stripes had burned themselves into memory as a visual trigger, an association between identity and danger. For years, some avoided air shows, others refused to fly again. Yet paradoxically, many also built model planes in their garages, carefully painting those same stripes by hand, as if to reclaim ownership of. The line between therapy and obsession blurred, just as the line between pride and guilt always had. Back in Europe, the landscape still bore the war's marks. Farmers ploughed around wrecks. Children found bits of aluminum in fields. Women hung laundry on lines strung between rusting propellers. The sky above them was clear, but every now and then, when a plane flew over, people would look up instinctively, searching for stripes that were no longer there. The war had ended, but its rhythm had imprinted itself on the continent. Black, white, silence, echo. The Allies themselves changed. The nations that had stood together under those stripes drifted apart in the politics of peace. A new kind of war, the Cold One, crept in, and the unity once painted across thousands of wings became a memory wrapped in nostalgia. Yet even then, the old airmen who met at reunions, sitting beneath fading photographs, spoke of the stripes like an unspoken code. They would nod, exchange a glance, and understand. It wasn't about victory anymore, it was about recognition. They had lived through something no words could capture, but a single image could. By the 1980s, when museums began restoring wartime aircraft, curators debated whether to repaint the invasion markings or preserve the metal bare. Veterans always answered the same way: paint them. Not for glory, they said, but for memory. Because without those lines, the planes looked naked, incomplete, like the story itself was missing its heartbeat. Every restored aircraft that took to the air carried more than history. It carried the emotion of all those who had seen the sky divided into black and white. Today, as the last of those men fade from living memory, the stripes remain as their echo. Each time one of those planes climbs into the air at an anniversary or memorial flight, the same feeling returns to those who watch, the mix of awe, grief, and strange comfort. The pattern is simple, but the weight it carries is infinite. The paint has long been polished and renewed, but the story beneath it cannot be repainted. It belongs to the generation that flew under it, and to the silence that followed them home. Because in the end, the invasion stripes weren't just marks on metal. They were the proof that human hands can make order out of chaos, even if only for a moment. They were a promise between men who might never meet again, a signal that said, "I see you, don't shoot, we're on the same side." And perhaps that's the deepest meaning they left behind, that in a world built on conflict, there can still be recognition between strangers, still a shared signal of humanity painted across the machinery of war. 80 years later, the black and white stripes still fly. You can see them on the wings of restored Spitfires, Mustangs, and C-47s at air shows across the world. When they pass overhead, the crowd always falls silent for a moment. The sound of those engines isn't just nostalgia, it's memory, carried on the wind. Children wave, cameras click, and somewhere in the noise of the propellers, there's a whisper of everything those planes once were: fear, courage, and the fragile balance between them. The stripes mean different things to different people. To historians, they represent the ingenuity of coordination, the simple idea that saved countless lives during the most complex invasion in history. To artists, they are a perfect symbol: black and white, chaos and order, life and death painted side by side. But to those who were there, or to those who inherited their silence, they mean something more profound. They are proof that clarity can exist even in confusion, that humanity can mark itself even on machines built for destruction. There's something deeply human about the way those stripes were born, not planned, not elegant, not designed in a lab, but painted by tired hands on the eve of something unimaginable. They were imperfect, uneven, made in haste, yet they worked. They united an entire army of nations under one symbol. In a war that had divided the world, the invasion stripes were one of the few things that brought it together, if only for a while. Maybe that's why they endure. Because they were never just military marking, they were an act of connection. When you look at the old photographs now, the men painting by lantern light, the endless formations crossing the channel, the faded wings resting in fields, you can almost hear the voices that time has swallowed. You can hear laughter forced through exhaustion, arguments over whether the lines were straight enough, someone shouting over the noise of engines that they were running out of paint. Ordinary people doing something extraordinary without realizing. They didn't know they were painting history. They were just trying to survive the morning. After the war, many of those men lived quiet lives. They became mechanics, farmers, teachers. Some never mentioned the war again. But when they saw those black and white bands in old newsreels or on the side of a museum aircraft, something inside them stirred, because they remembered what the stripes had meant. Not victory, not power, but recognition. They meant "I know you." In the smoke and confusion, they were a way to see each other, to tell friend from foe, to hold on to the simplest truth that still defines survival: knowing who stands beside you. And maybe that's why, decades later, the invasion stripes still speak to us. Not because of the war, but because of the human story beneath it. We live in a world still divided, still struggling to recognize itself. And those black and white bands, once painted in haste before the greatest gamble in history, still remind us that unity is possible when everything else is chaos. That even in a world of violence, the act of seeing each other clearly, of saying, "Don't shoot, we're on the same side," is still the beginning of peace. The planes that carried those stripes are almost all gone now. The few that remain are restored with care, their engines rebuilt, their paint reapplied. Every time one takes to the air, you can feel the years fall away. For a few minutes, the sky looks the way it did in 1944, full of motion, sound, and purpose. The stripes flash in the sun, and everyone watching feels something they can't quite name, something between pride and sorrow, history and humanity. The past becomes present again, and for a moment, the ghosts of that generation fly once more. That's what the invasion stripes have become. A reminder not of war, but of connection. They are what happens when fear and courage share the same space, when survival becomes unity, and when the act of being seen becomes the first step toward freedom. Black and white, life and death, us and them, painted together on wings that carried the weight of the world. If this story moved you, if it made you see history not as dates and battles, but as people, Real hands, real choices, real hope. Then take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because these stories matter. Because remembering is how we keep them flying.